Good evening. I'm Piotr Bednarski, host of this program, and I'm very pleased to welcome you all to this program on the Catholic Church, Culture and Society. Today we will host a very interesting speaker and person who is very much involved in areas which are close to our hearts. We host today Ryan Christopher, who is a founder and former director of the Alliance Defending Freedom, an advocacy group fighting for the religious liberty, freedom of conscience, protecting Christians against persecution in UK. Ryan is a graduate of Cambridge University in history, but he also studied philosophy and theology at Pontifical University of St. Thomas Aquinas and Gregorian University in Rome. Ryan, we are very warmly welcome you in our program. We are very happy that you agreed to participating in this program and hope to have good conversation.
Thank you so much. Yeah, it's such a pleasure to be with everyone.
We organized this program with EWT and Poland, Christian Center for Culture of Mary Our Queen, Lay Catholic Association Przybądźcie Wierni. With me is Zbigniew Przybłowski, my co-producer, and we are supported by EWTN staff. Łukasz is with us. So, following our good tradition, let's start by praying to God especially for the peace in the world, in Holy Land and in Ukraine and other places when there is a conflict. Let us ask our God for the peace and for the solution of all these difficult problems. Our Pater Noster, qui es in celis, sanctificetur nomen tuum, adveniat regnum tuum, fiat voluntas tua, sicut et in cielo et in terra, panem nostrum quotidianum da nobis hodie, and debita nobis
debita nostra, sicut et nos dimittimus debitoribus nostris, et nos inducas in
tentationem, sed libera nos a malo. Zbigniew, the floor is yours, and please start the interview.
Thank you. Good evening, Ryan. Good evening, everyone. Let me just go through the first question. We would like you to tell us a little bit about the organization, about yourself and the organization that you work for. So you held the position of a director of ADF UK. What is ADF and what does it do? Could you make it a little bit more familiar to our listeners?
Yeah, of course. ADF stands for the Alliance Defending Freedom. As it sounds, it's an American-founded organization. And thanks be to God for our American brothers and sisters, honestly. That's how I feel as a European and as a Brit, for the work that they began 25 years or so ago. It was founded by a man called Alan Sears, who, as his time as founder, converted to Catholicism, in part because of the writings of Joseph Ratzinger and the reasoning and the beauty of that theology. But it was founded originally as just a defense fund. So it was originally called the Alliance Defense Fund, and it was just designed to be a pot of money that lawyers could then use to take important religious liberty cases in the United States. And this was done because, the various churches got together and realized, actually, some very prominent evangelical businessmen in particular realized that they were losing systematically in the courts, and that often the other side that were looking to create so-called progressive change in society through judicial activism and legal precedent had a kind of joined up strategy to doing so. And it was starting to change the nature of American society. And so it was the first legal defense organization, as I understand it, that's very big and well known of its kind. And it's continued to grow ever since. There are now hundreds of staff. I think on First Amendment issues in the US, it's the biggest legal firm, regardless of whether it's a nonprofit or not. And yeah, it's as you can imagine, it creates a feeling of security for a lot of Americans that share Christian values, and it's scary to people that don't share those values. There were two key elements, I think, to what Alan Sears, as founder, had in mind around ADF. The first was obviously setting precedent in the courtrooms, and the second was to train a new elite in the American legal profession. And he saw this as just as important as the first element of a ministry like ADF, because that second aspect was about intergenerational change. And people are policy, and institutions are only as good as the people, and the principles that institutions were founded on only continue to be the foundations if people believe in them and act according to them. And so, for a generation of American lawyers that believed in the Constitution in a traditional sense, that believed in the rule of law in the traditional sense, and also had a Christian worldview, an understanding of the natural law, an understanding of what true law and justice is to underpin their legal practice, he set up a training academy that's called the Blackstone Training Academy. And we're now seeing that intergenerational effect of him doing that, because we now have thousands of lawyers in the US that have gone through the Blackstone program, and they are, clerks or judges at the state or federal level all over the United States now. And the most high profile alumnus would be Amy Coney Barrett, who was grilled quite heavily in her confirmation hearings by the Democrats because she, attended this terrible groups training program called Blackstone. And so, obviously our hope is that increasingly across the United States and across obviously Europe as well and beyond, there is a new elite rising up, or a new generation of young Christians, Catholics, again, for our Catholic audience here, who are in positions of influence and have the confidence to articulate, that worldview and the best of what made the West good, insofar as the West has been good. So there are two key elements to that at the beginning. And I'll just say, if I was to describe what we do now in terms of our advocacy with governments, in legislative chambers, in the courtroom, in the media, really it's this headline: we exist so that you can live out and speak the truth. As Catholics who are listening to this program, we are absolutely 100% behind you. We understand what you believe and why, and we're here to advocate for you at all the major institutions across the world, and the most significant ones anyway, and often at regional legislative levels and before governments too.
And are you present in UK only, or is your presence a pan-European presence?
Yeah, outside of the US, ADF International would be based in Vienna, actually. We see that as a really good central spot for the rest of the world. Most of the world can get to Vienna pretty easily. And so the UK team, my team, even when I was UK director, would look up to Vienna as the mothership in that sense. And so we have offices that are international offices in places like DC. We have offices we have ADF India. We have offices in Latin America, and all sorts of parts of the world. So in particular in Europe, we tend to be focused around the big international soft and hard law institutions: the European Court of Human Rights, Strasbourg, Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe, also European Parliament in Brussels, obviously in the UK for slightly different reasons, but very connected in that broader European sense. So we tend to be where the big institutions are. And so the same for Geneva, UN, New York, UN would also have ADF international offices, because, we're living in a world that is increasingly globalized, whether that's good or bad. And local advocacy is global advocacy, and global advocacy is increasingly local advocacy, again, for good or for bad. But we recognize that if there's one organization around the world that currently has the scope and the responsibility to engage globally in a joined up way, then it's us, it's ADF.
Okay, and how did you become the director of the UK ADF, and what did you and what do you do specifically in the ADF?
Yeah, my taking the role of director was probably a result of being part of a very small local team initially. And when you're part of a small local team, you have to be involved in a little bit of everything. And that's one of the really fun parts of a job like working for ADF International as an advocate. You're not just, if you're a lawyer, just lawyering, not just in legal texts. You're hosting allies, you're creating media strategies, you're involved to some degree in the brand, you are an ambassador for the organization and its values. And so there's a real rich variety of professional activity to be had. And I think when the UK team was starting to grow, it was natural that, you know, someone in the office who'd been there the longest, in my case, might take that position up and help others and mentor them and help grow the presence in the UK for strategic purposes. And so that was a great pleasure and a privilege, most because my colleagues are so exceptional.
Okay. And maybe you could tell us a little bit about yourself personally. I understand you're a Catholic, and that is not a very frequent occurrence in the UK, I understand. How did you become Catholic? Were you born Catholic, or were you baptized or converted? How did you come to the faith in this secular world?
Yeah, I think my background is quite typical of people that are Catholic of my age in the UK. You know, my mother comes from an Irish family that came over a generation or two ago, and my father is Polish, and you know, his parents are both Polish. But as is quite typical, I think, for my parents' generation, the practice that was handed down to them was quite nominal. You know, it wasn't like on the Polish side, I think culturally it was important that we were Catholic, but you know, I don't think my father's parents were especially careful about going to mass every Sunday and showing that that was a priority. And so, you know, growing up, I was in a position where living with my mother, she hadn't grown up with a habit of practicing. And it was slightly later in her life when I was, you know, over the age of 10, early teens, that she came back to her faith. Thank God. I'm really grateful for that. And for a period of time, that was quite difficult for me as a young man because, you know, I remember looking at children from the Christian schools near me and thinking they were weird. And we'd call them Bible bashers and mock them, you know, as a young boy. And then all of a sudden, you know, I'm going to mass and, you know, we were living in Manchester, you know, and we went to a variety of things like Latin mass and charismatic and, you know, the whole spectrum. And I found it really odd as a young man. And I found it quite difficult to some degree. But I knew a couple of things. One, my gut feeling told me there was something here. I think the Lord had planted something deep in me of knowing he was my father and he was there for me. And I knew that this was really important for my mother, who I loved dearly. And so, you know, that was enough to keep me practicing to the point where I had a couple of things happen that really confirmed me as Catholic for my own sake. One was an extraordinary supernatural event. And, you know, I was going to tell my mother that I was going to stop going to mass. And it was a weeknight mass. And after I received communion, I had this most extraordinary and overwhelming sense of God's love for me. In a sense, I can't put words to describe it, as you can imagine. But it was so intense, it kind of disabled me physically for the most part. I couldn't speak for 4 or 5 hours afterwards. I was shaking and I was uncontrollably crying with the emotional reaction I had to it. And when I finally recovered that evening, my mother said to me, what happened, basically. She was very calm because she's a very spiritual lady. And I think she had some intuition as to what was going on. And I said, Mum, I was going to tell you I was going to stop going to mass tonight. And I don't know what to do about this now. I mean, obviously, God's touched me in some way. And, you know, that was enough to keep me going. That experience is enough to keep me going in the habit until the point where my mother introduced me to some really impressive, you know, relatively young Catholic clergy. Some of whom had been like astrophysicists at Cambridge, some of whom were philosophers by background. And they provided the kind of intellectual answers that I needed as a young man in order to at least get me to the point where I understood that I felt that Catholicism was the best explanation of how human beings are and how the world is. And if there's going to be any hope in this world or any true meaning to notions like love, then Christianity provided the answer to those things. And so along with that spiritual experience, that intellectual journey, I think was mostly there by my early 20s.
Mm-hmm. I understand that you considered priesthood at some point. So you have gone quite deeply into the religious life, but then you went on to study philosophy and theology in Rome. How did that happen? And
yeah,
how does that experience sort of influence what you are doing right now?
Yeah, no, it massively influences everything I do. And that study of philosophy and theology was a part of my seminary training, for which I'll be forever grateful, because honestly, it provided a intellectual foundation that I think every child should have. And I should have had before the age of, I think I was 26 when I was in seminary. And, I'd gone through a prestigious university like Cambridge, and I'd gone through the British education system, and I couldn't use grammar properly in my writing, and being forced to learn Latin, for example, at the Angelicum, for 2 years, changed the way that I think, even in English now, and use my English language in practice, even if it doesn't come across in this interview quite so well. But, there are very basic things like that to the intellectual foundations that I think, are the Western tradition that every young person should have access to, that I only got through seminary. And so I'll always be grateful, obviously, for that, and for the fact that it brought me closer to Jesus. Everyone has their own personal spirituality to some degree, I believe. And the way that I feel especially intimate with the Lord is through philosophical and theological inquiry. And so for me, it was a deeply spiritual blessing in my life that I was able to spend 4.5 years formally studying theology and philosophy. So yeah, that was a great privilege, and to do it in Rome as well, obviously had its massive upsides and some downsides as well, because you see the imperfection of the church in practice, as will always be the case. Now, in terms of how it influences my work now, some of my lawyer colleagues, not all of them, would admit, because lawyers are quite proud, that they wish that they'd had the foundations that I had before they studied law. Because I think in so many ways, we're now living at a time where we have to re-explain Western principles back to a Western audience, or we have to re-articulate how certain things have a hierarchy, or certain things are good or bad, from first principles, because we can't assume that the culture, that those things are held in the culture anymore, or that there's institutional memory, or that there's community memory for those things. And so, being able to do that on most issues is a real blessing for our work, because, if I'm working with one of our specialist lawyers, an example would be the Scottish church closure case, which we might talk about later. I was able to look into, principles of canon law and the principles of sacramental life, and explain that to them, so that they could then present it to the court in a way that might help the legal arguments to win. And so there's a lot of double teaming in that regard, I would say, in the work that we do. But also, I think we're living at a time where a lot of even Christian parliamentarians or leaders in government have lost the confidence of how to explain what they believe, right? There are a lot of people in government or in parliament in lots of countries in Europe, I think, who are faithful. They have a childlike faith in the Lord. They have a beautiful faith. They pray. They really believe, and they want to be faithful to the church. But they don't know from themselves how to explain from first principles and to make the arguments that they need to make within parliament or within government or whatever that forum might be. And so being able to do that alongside them, I think, is a real blessing that the church has given me in order to serve its people through training me in those years.
Okay, yeah, I think your English is quite fine,
Well, I've got Manchester accents, and not many Brits would say that.
Okay, all right, but you sound very Cambridge to me. Maybe I'm mistaken. And coming to Cambridge, you said that a lot of people in today's society are not aware of the cultural heritage that we have. But you studied history in Cambridge. How do the British people, how does the British society, what's their level of their knowledge? How do they understand history? And do they understand, thanks to historical education, you know, what their background is, what their heritage is, and do they understand what kind of sort of historical megatrends they're a part of?
Yeah, I think obviously it depends, you know, child by child. I used to teach history as well for a while at secondary level, and so I understand the kind of curricula that are offered here in the UK, or at least were till about 10 years ago. And you know, the way that history is framed, at least when I was teaching the subject fairly recently, was very much about progress for liberal democracy, however you might broadly define that. So it was a progressive vision. It was a kind of a somewhat a Whig vision of history, like there was a determined kind of progress. And there was an awful lot of focus on particular political movements that are in sync with, I think, with what the zeitgeist might see as progress, either rightly or wrongly, right? So, you know, the civil rights movement in the USA is quite a focus often in history for UK students, because there's a sense of, you know, fundamental equality at stake. And obviously that's good, right? In one sense. But that would often be to the detriment of understanding, for example, other deeper aspects of English history, like, you know, what made our constitution what it is, you know, in real detail. You know, can I really explain that? Why does the common law have the principles that it has? Where did it come from? Why would courts assume before positive law, more recent positive law like the Human Rights Act or the European Convention, that the right to life exists and every human life is sacred? I don't think young people in my lifetime in most schools would be given a kind of historical grounding to understand the foundations on which this country was built. And I'd say in particular, the deeply Christian Anglo-Saxon and medieval period is skirted over. If you cover those periods, it's not because of the extraordinary progress in law or the deep thinking or scientific inquiry. It's usually about what was it like to be a peasant in medieval England, and wasn't it terrible? And feudalism, which was terrible, was then ultimately overcome. And that kind of historical narrative, again, I understand this narrative, it's not the worst, but it misses the real heart of understanding what it is to be British historically, and to have the toolkit as a young person to understand why our constitution is as it is, why our political system is as it is. And so you might skip from, you know, being a feudal peasant in medieval England straight through to legal and social reform in the 19th century. Maybe you'll have a quick trip to the Tudors because it's interesting and Henry beheaded a lot of his wives, right? But like you'll go straight to what's the next kind of big moment of political progress, and that is voting rights in like the 1830s, 1860s. And again, there's lots of good reasons to focus on that to some degree. I'm not saying that everything we teach is bad, but I think the fundamentals are often completely skipped and completely missed. And even from a Catholic perspective in particular, this notion that, you know, women weren't able to be powerful or contribute to society, just as one example, you know, you understand that that wasn't always true in every context. When you study someone like St. Hilda of Whitby, you know, that helped convene a synod that decided the date of Easter for the church, or, you know, one of the patrons of one of my daughters, you know, St. Edith of Wilton, who was a princess of the Anglo-Saxon court and ruled a monastery that was extremely powerful. And she was far better educated than 99% of the men she would have known, for example. So there are all sorts of really core aspects to how Britain was built, England or Scotland or Ireland or Wales was built, that we miss, sadly.
So I'm asking this question because it seems to me that if there is an absence of knowledge of history, then the population is easy to manipulate, and then you can sort of twist. And then with the absence of the fundamental concepts of the Christian culture and, you know, European culture, and religion and civilization, it's easy to twist terms, to change their meaning and to sort of lead people into very difficult situations where all of a sudden they find themselves in a trap. And that's where my question about history comes from. Maybe we could talk about a couple of specific cases that your organization was involved with. So, one of the interesting things for the Polish audience would be to hear about the case of Julia Rynkiewicz, and her sort of travails. What was her crime and what was her punishment, if you will?
So Julia's crime in practice was to be publicly pro-life whilst training to be a midwifery student, nursing student here in the UK. And this is University of Nottingham, that hasn't had a great public record with regards to Catholic principles being expressed publicly in recent years. We've been involved with them on 3 occasions in recent years. Julia was the president of the Pro-Life Society for the university, and it was clear that a couple of members of staff from the university didn't think that you could be genuinely pro-life and somehow provide a, in inverted commas, neutral professional service to women, some of whom might have had abortions or some of whom might want abortions in the future. And so, I guess the ideology behind the lecturers trying to censor Julia was that it isn't possible to hold those things together in a professional manner. And so what ended up happening was she was reported by some of members of staff, some of whom taught her, that she had been presenting materials on the pro-life stall at the Freshers' Fair that might betray the sense that, again, she could be a neutral practitioner insofar as anyone can ever be fully neutral in a profession like being a doctor or a nurse. That's an ethical profession. And so the university suspended her. They investigated her and suspended her from clinical practice, which in effect meant that she couldn't finish her academic year. Now, to cut a very long story short, she was ultimately offered an apology, and the university accepted that it made some mistakes in the way that they had handled Julia's case. But the interesting thing is this scenario absolutely was not in line with where regulation is in the UK or where the law is in the UK with regards to someone's right to expression of their fundamental beliefs, like the right to life, or their religious expression. And Julia is a very devout Catholic mum now. And so despite the law and the regulation for the profession supporting Julia's position, she was still found herself suspended from her academic course. And the lecturers involved still felt so emboldened that it would somehow be acceptable or normal to try to prevent her from qualifying as a pro-life person. And so there's a deeper question there beyond law and regulation into the culture of universities, the culture with regards to freedom of expression and divergent viewpoints, and in particular with regards to how universities are interpreting what they believe to be competing concerns with regards to safety or people being able to avoid views that they find uncomfortable or distressing. And I think we in the UK are in the middle of working out where that's going to land for a generation with regards to those so apparently competing principles.
Would you say so? There was a clear sort of intent to sort of freeze certain viewpoints and prevent certain people from going into midwifery, with their professing their openly their views. Would you think that your intervention sort of put a stop to it? What was the overall reaction? So did you succeed? Did that freeze attempt succeed, or did you succeed in preventing it to happen? How would you assess?
Yeah, we weren't able to prevent the suspension for that year. It was from the point Julia was suspended, almost immediately she was going to be unable to finish the academic year because she couldn't have the clinical practice you require. And so it was always going to be a case of, will the university recognize that they've caused a detriment and that needs to be rectified, and there needs to be an apology. And those things happened. And so we were able to get that from the university. And most of the cases we take involving universities and freedom of speech are settled informally, like before they get to the higher courts or even to any court at all. Because again, the law is broadly on our side, and we've recently had a strengthening of that law here in the UK more recently that, I'm delighted to say, many people I know were involved in to some degree. But the point, again, isn't always the law. It's what is the internal culture of these institutions. And so what it usually takes, sadly for us, is if Julia had just emailed back as she did and said, hang on a minute, this isn't fair. I'm pretty sure I'm allowed to express myself as a pro-life woman outside of the context of my midwifery course. That wouldn't have got very far. The fact that an organization like ADF can come in and say, hey, we're involved, we understand the law, and, this letter is without prejudice, but you could find yourself in a legal fight here, which obviously everybody wants to avoid. At that point, the lawyers for the university get involved, and then you start to see results. And so often it's a case of, if it's left to some of the HR people at an institution or some of the diversity and inclusion officers, and I hope that doesn't make any sense to you as a title in Poland. I hope you don't have these titles yet. But we have thousands of people in the UK employed to be diversion and inclusion officers that often wrongly interpret the balancing of these rights in practice. And so it often takes the institutional lawyer to get involved, because we've triggered that by saying, hang on a minute, you don't want this to go legal. And they then say, no, under the law, Julia has a right to do what she's doing, or you need to be more careful. So that's often the role we play in these kind of cases.
Okay, and you also represented in two sort of very famous international cases of Päivi Räsänen and Isabel von Spruce, and both of them are quite interesting. Could you say a couple of words about the crimes and punishments in both of these cases?
Yeah, I mean, in the case of Päivi, her crime was to tweet about contribution to a pride march. And, Päivi wasn't even tweeting to anybody outside of her church. She was tweeting her own church leadership to say, should you be really formally involved in pride? Because I'm not sure that's in line with certain scriptural passages. And she quoted one of those scriptural passages. So that was Päivi's crime. Now, the law that she's been in court under also includes terrorism. It couldn't be more ridiculous. And so what we've had in Päivi's case is, in theory, this is a very serious criminal charge.
If I may, does that mean that she sent a tweet to her congregation and there was a Judas there who denounced her to the police and said this is a crime of terrorism?
You know what? I'm not sure, actually. I'm not sure who the exact person was that sent that tweet. But what the police should have done once that was reported was to recognize that, hang on a minute, she isn't causing, she isn't crossing a criminal threshold by any reasonable standard. And she's certainly within the broad protections of human rights with regards to freedom of expression. And so, they should have dropped it then and there. But what they did instead was to interrogate her with regards to her theological beliefs. And that didn't end at the police station. That's continued for 3 court hearings now, whereby the prosecution, has said various times, we're not here to, interrogate you for your religious beliefs, but what do you really believe sin is? As though that's relevant then to whether she should be prosecuted or not. So, this is the very definition of a show trial, in my view, the Päivi case. And, we've had, political commentators in Europe, some of whom say it's one of the most significant trials of the last century, because, what it could mark, in Europe in the general sense is a real senior public figure. I mean, Päivi was, a senior minister for Home Affairs in Finland, and she's currently a sitting MP. This case could mark a very public figure being prosecuted, if the prosecution is successful, on the basis of her theological beliefs with regards to human sexuality and sin. And, you know, that hasn't happened for a while in Europe, in most countries, right? In post-Reformation. It's been quite a long time since we've had trials. And so we could be into a new openly ideological era. Now, obviously, I hope and pray and do believe that Päivi will be acquitted once again. But like so many of the cases we deal with, the process is the punishment, right? The other side know that they're unlikely to get a successful prosecution. But this is, you know, this is a kind of cultural enforcement designed to have a chilling effect on Christians being openly Christian in any sphere that is public, from being a parliamentarian to Twitter to Facebook to the pub to the cafe to the workplace. It's designed to stop us expressing ourselves as people of integrity. And, you know, I know on Päivi's part, she believes that she's not doing this for any personal reason. She's doing this because she believes this highlights the situation that so many other Christians find themselves in on a regular basis.
So in essence, she's persecuted for her Christian beliefs in a country that is formerly Christian, now a post-Christian country. And now there's a sort of a reality that is even more troubling, and that is the 1984 thought crime case of Isabel von Spruce. Could you say a couple of words about that?
I mean, I think this is, again, along with Päivi, I think this is a really seminal, you know, Isabel's situation might not ultimately become a big case in terms of the higher courts, but the fact that she has been arrested repeatedly under fairly new laws in the UK and some very new laws for what the contents of her mind, I think does in and of itself mark a moment in Europe. It could be a turning point for the good, or it could be a turning point for the very bad. And, you know, in the UK, we've seen a lot of so-called liberal commentators defend or be quiet with regards to Isabel's situation because they are ideologically pro-abortion. And that's been really disappointing to see. So Isabel's crime was her initial arrest was to stand near an abortion facility where she'd had, you know, years of ministry and helped hundreds of women personally who had crisis pregnancies, who felt unable to continue that pregnancy without support. She'd had years of standing in that exact spot, helping women who needed her help, who wanted her help. And she did it after a law had changed, a local law that prohibited expressive prayer, you know, things like approaching women on the topic of abortion, having conversations on the topic of abortion. I mean, this law is really egregious and breaks all sorts of, you know, criminal and constitutional principles here in the UK. Plenty of liberal legal scholars have noted that aspect of these laws. So she decided that she was going to do something that she believed wasn't breaking that law, but might still enable her to do some good for people involved, which is to stand there silently, so praying. And because Isabel's a practicing Catholic, she believes that silent prayer has an effect. And she believes there's a significance to place as well, right? You know, we bless places, we pray in places, we go on pilgrimage, we go to people's graves because places are significant to us as Catholics. And I think just as humans, right? And so she decided to be in that.
The police obviously must have believed the same.
Exactly. And it kind of confirms it implicitly, right? And so she was there to pray for everybody involved in that place. And she was there to pray for the unborn. She was there to pray for the good of everyone there. And so when it came to her arrest, the fact that it was a thought crime was proven by, you know, which answer she gave that then led to her being arrested successfully. And so, you know, her standing there silently wasn't enough. And the police asked her, you know, what are you here for? Are you protesting? And she's like, no, I'm not protesting. Are you, you know, trying to counsel women? She's like, well, the facility's closed right now. You know, like there's no one here. The street's completely empty. And they were like, are you praying? And she was like, well, only in my mind. So there's no expressive prayer in that sense. And they were like, well, what are you praying about? And she was like, well, is your prayer connected to abortion? She was like, yeah, it's connected to the unborn and what happens in this place. And so on getting that answer, she was then arrested. if she had said, I'm praying for an end to global warming, or I'm praying for, you know, the Knicks basketball team to win the World Series, she would not have been arrested. So it wasn't the fact that she was praying silently, it was the content of that silent prayer that was the formal trigger for her being arrested. And there is no other word to put on that, no other title to put on it than thought crime. And so it's a really tricky position that I think prosecutors find themselves under, because the zeitgeist and a lot of the elite that are pro-abortion in principle do believe that Isabel should be successfully prosecuted. They do believe that her silent praying for the good of everybody is so damaging to society that a criminal charge is justified. And yet at the same time, it's inescapable how significant a successful prosecution for this would be for the UK, for its reputation internationally, for our legal history, and for the precedent being set elsewhere. Because we know as well, very, very well at ADF, that it isn't going to stop there. You know, the intent behind these laws and the intent behind the people that frame these laws is to completely erase any pro-life expression from any public scenario. You know, in France, we've seen laws brought in that prevent pro-life expression online very explicitly. I think, you know, there are many here in the UK that would like to do that to people like Isabel and myself. I think we'll also see, if they're successful in prosecuting Isabel, or this line being drawn here legally and in precedent, then I think the next step will be to remove all pro-life expression from any part of the street, any part of the town, any part of the countryside. Why? Because the same warped logic will apply, which is that any form of expression around abortion that isn't encouraging a woman only to have it is inherently so destructive and dangerous to women that it cannot be countenanced. So why stop near an abortion facility? You know, 1 in 3, 1 in 4 women in UK society have had an abortion. You know, according to that logic, it makes sense to remove pro-life expression from all parts of society, every advert, every street. And so, you know, it's a big moment with regards to our human rights laws on expression and our human rights laws on under what's technically Article 8 under the European Convention, the Human Rights Act, the right to privacy, which has been extended and perverted over the last years to encompass this kind of thing.
Well, then that article obviously doesn't apply to the privacy of a person's mind and what they hold in their minds. It seems like this is a very anti-life move, and this is a very anti-Catholic move, because, or Christian in general, because it's the Christians who hold the unborn as a full human person from conception to natural death. And so it is sort of a persecution of that brave lady on 2 levels: on her being a Christian, on her protecting life. Could you tell us a little bit? I'm not sure if your organization is involved in the cases of people who are deprived of life support in the British hospitals now. We had a very famous case of a famous here in Poland, of a Polish person who died in Plymouth Hospital in 2021, who was disconnected 4 times from life support despite his family wanting to take him to Poland. We had Alfie Evans, and now we have the story of Indy Gregory. Is your organization involved in that, in those cases? And, you know, what does that signify? Because this is sort of taking care of, quote unquote, of human life on the other side, yeah, towards the end of life.
These cases really exhibit just how far the right to life, or the value of life, in and of itself has completely evaporated with regards to having any sense of value when it comes to judicial decision making in the United Kingdom. You know, something that again was something that didn't need to be written down in our common law era, really, that life is sacred, from conception till natural death, because there aren't the explicit protections for that, or the interpretation of what should be explicit protections for that. That bears no weight when these legal decisions are made. And the reason we've got ourselves in this position in the UK, particularly with regards to children and end of life. So most famously, Charlie Gard, I know Charlie's parents quite well, and they're wonderful people. And I was very close to that family for a period of time. And I've also, met Alfie Evans' parents too. The reason we generally don't litigate those cases is because the legal precedent in the courts is so bad that the chances of victory are so low. And so, if I was a parent, I would want to litigate it regardless, obviously. But we have a duty to steward the resources that we have, the time and the money that we have, to focus on things where we think there's a good chance of victory and a good precedent being set. And so sadly, the law in the UK is so bad that the moment a hospital disagrees with a parent with regards to the technical threshold is the best interests of the child, and I'll explain why that is in a moment, almost immediately you'll end up in a court situation that is very one-sided because of the information the hospital has and the parents don't have. And of course, you're going to get judges with very well set precedent that the hospital should win, hearing from expert doctors, versus parents or external doctors or second opinions that the parents can somehow bring before the court. So British courts are very pragmatic and very much respect, established authority with regards to expert opinion. And so the chances for a family in these scenarios is very low. And we got here by accident. So the law that kind of oversees these cases wasn't designed for these situations. It's basically an evolution of an act that was designed for other purposes around children, that has, through case law, become a standard, which is a best interest standard. And you can contrast that with a situation where the social services law of this country has a very much higher, well-established standard, which is serious harm. So let's say I'm just generally a bad dad to my son. I'm not feeding him well, I'm not looking after him well, and it's reported by the community. For social services on behalf of the state to take him out of my authority would require them to prove that my child is suffering serious harm. Mm-hmm. Now, that's a very well-established, clear test. Best interest, as you can tell straight away, is much fuzzier, much more general, and wasn't a specific test designed for these situations. And so, sadly, for most of these cases, like 9 out of 10 of them, the solution only is legislative reform, which is why we really believe in Charlie's law. So the Gard family, Charlie's family, have proposed a change to the law that would rebalance this imbalanced situation between the doctor and the parent and the state and the parent to make it far more reasonable. There were a couple of cases before the UK left the European Union that we were involved with that were able to get children out of the UK based on the European right to travel and to move within the European Union. But that was a very novel legal avenue to take, which is now closed after Brexit. So sadly for parents that I know, if it gets to the point where a hospital formally disagrees on the basis of best interests, you're almost certain to lose. And that is, quite frankly, from a Catholic perspective, completely unacceptable. In fact, the hospital that was looking after Charlie Gard was in my local supermarket earlier this evening and asked for my money. And I said, listen, until you change your policies on this as a hospital, I cannot in good conscience support you financially because you override parental authority. So, yeah, sad state of affairs here in the UK.
Yeah, and this is a really scary situation where the state usurps the right to override the authority of the parents. What are our states becoming when they do that? And what situations are we placed in? I must say, very many years ago, maybe 15, maybe 20 years ago, I read on the internet stories of Dutch people from the Netherlands when they had an illness and they felt that this might be a serious illness, they would not go to a doctor in Holland. They would travel to Germany because they feared that they might be euthanized in Holland. So this is a situation where a person goes to the hospital because they feel ill, and they are trapped in a system that they will decide about their life and death without respect for their loved ones, for their family. There's a path where it started, and I don't know exactly where this path did start, but it seems that the freedom that has been taken away from us, one of the most egregious examples was the limitation of the freedom of Christians to practice in churches during the so-called COVID era. And you had a very big victory in that area in terms of the Scots resisting the government and fighting for their right to provide services to the faithful, and what example they set for the rest of us. Could you tell us a couple of words about that situation?
Yeah, it was the first legal victory against government regulations here in the UK for anything around COVID. And it was a very significant moment. And there were lots of, it wasn't just the Scottish church closure case, it was several around Europe that were able to litigate along similar lines, and they were all victorious, thankfully. This is one area where the convention and its interpretation, was very helpful. Here in the UK, it was a constitutional question, and it was also then a human rights question too. And luckily, the highest court in Scotland, which is where the regulations we were challenging were, found that it was disproportionate for the Scottish state to criminalise the opening of churches when, at the same time, they were allowing bicycle shops to be open for bicycle repairs and supermarkets to be open for food. And the closest comparator that was made in the court on the day was the right to have your case heard in court. And in the UK, in Scotland, they were using cinemas with social distancing in order to have trials. And so the key question, I think, on the day really to the government's lawyers was from the judge to say, why is the right to have speedy justice a higher right than the right to, for example, a Catholic be able to visit the very presence of God as he or she might understand it, or to receive the forgiveness of their sins as he or she might understand it? Why is that right higher than the other? If you're willing to risk an element of contagion as a result of bicycle shops or trials in cinemas, why not allow people to social distance in church? And so, rightly so, the court found that that is a disproportionate discrimination with regards to Article 9 rights to religious expression and life. And, the Catholic aspect in that case was very significant because one of the applicants was a Catholic priest, Canon Thomas White. And, he was making the argument that under canon law, he has a duty to open his church. In fact, the way that canon law puts it is you need grave reason not to open your church, which was the highest, most serious reason not to open your church at all. And several Scottish bishops also put in a kind of letter to the court, which I think was very influential to explain the theological and pastoral implications of closing Catholic churches to Catholics, because, of course, we believe in the sacramental economy as the normal means by which God heals and saves us as Catholics. And so, luckily, the court, and rightly so, the court took that seriously, because the Scottish government, in effect, was saying, you can still worship, you can still have Christian life to the full, just with some inconvenience. And, Canon Tom, as a Catholic priest, is saying, no, you've completely misunderstood what it is to worship in a Catholic sense, and you've completely misunderstood how incarnational everything is that we need to do. You can only have the sacraments in person. That's the form of the sacraments. And so that then, I think, was one of the big moments nationally that said, you know what, some of what the state has done here is to desperately overreach, both in principle and in practice, with regards to religious rights or freedom of movement, freedom of expression more generally in that period.
And again, it seems that also here, the Catholics, Christians in general, but in Catholics specifically, were sort of discriminated to a higher degree than other people. So the people who do not believe in God at all and could travel, you know, on the public transportation, could gather in bike shops and stuff like that, and other religions who are not prevented from holding their ceremonies or their prayers in the open. Would you agree that this is a disproportionate treatment of Catholics as well?
I think in the UK framework, it would be seen as indirect discrimination. So it wouldn't be seen as, you know, was the government openly trying to, you know, affect Catholics most particularly? The answer to that, I think, is no, honestly. But, you know, indirect discrimination is where it affects certain groups in a particular way, regardless of your intent. And then the question usually is, well, is it legitimate, you know, given that it's indirect? You know, is there a legitimate reason behind that policy that is proportionate enough? And that really was what the case was all about. And so, again, rightly so, the court found that in practice, this is indirect discrimination in the general sense, I mean, and that it was disproportionate to impose this kind of restriction for the kind of effect they were hoping to have, because the Scottish government, you know, could not prove that that measure would save a life. Even they couldn't prove it.
And my last question on that. Sorry, go ahead.
Oh no, please.
No, my last question on that would be: will your victory in this case prevent such measures by the government in the future?
I think, in a very narrow sense, yes, it should, and in a broader sense, in a narrow sense, it can and does. In a broader sense, it should. Like, I think any government that's looking to impose restrictions and rule by department, as we had here in the UK, we had very unconstitutional mode of government here in general, which is a big part of the problem. So you had very rushed decisions made by departments, you know, not going through the same kind of parliamentary scrutiny that would happen, or the human rights tests that would usually happen as part of passing laws that have such a fundamental effect on society, or such a restrictive effect on a person or groups. And so there should be a pause for thought in light of all of that. My concern, honestly, is that I think as a society in general, we've not had the big conversations about that time and whether we got the balance right in terms of checks and balances and constitutional appropriateness. And I think even, frankly, as a Catholic within the church, I still think there's a big conversation that we need to have ahead of the next scenario that could be next year, could be in 20, where we're very clear about what our red lines are and why. And we're very clear about how we articulate what serves the common good and doesn't in an authentically Catholic manner. Because I think at times there was a panicked retreat to utilitarian type thinking, which is not in the Catholic tradition whatsoever, and left a lot of faithful Catholics, I think, individually very exposed for standing out against that kind of rhetoric and some of those policies as well. So I think there are two big conversations that we're at risk of missing society-wide, maybe Europe-wide, and also within the church itself, quite frankly.
Okay. You need to turn off your microphone. Turn on your microphone, Piotr.
Let me switch to another area which is quite important for us, is freedom and truth. And when you describe this, all these situations, when there is these are examples of real threats to freedom, especially freedom of conscience, freedom of religions, religious liberty, we see that this kind of problems operate on various levels of society. And you mentioned that in terms of the laws and regulations, the setup is not that bad, but the problem is when it comes to the execution, so executive power. And I remember in one of your interviews, you mentioned that mid-level kind of civil servants mechanism. Could you comment on that? Because we see certain similarities with European Commission, with executive branch of in Poland. What's your assessment of the mechanics? Why this happens? Because these are such fundamental law rights, but they are still violated.
Yeah, I think in a lot of the key institutions in this country, and this has a lot of, there's a lot of national discussion about this right now. In a lot of the key institutions here in the UK, and of course we see it in international institutions too, there is a general zeitgeist or a general ideology or set of principles that are spoken and unspoken that you have to believe in order to look like a virtuous person in that context. In order to be able to have the dinner table conversations and be accepted socially. Like, it's the most human thing in the world is, if I'm a diplomat or if I'm a member of a UN committee or if I'm a mid-level senior civil servant in the UK government, that I want to be accepted and liked by my colleagues. And so if you don't have strong principles of a worldview or a religion, whatever it might be, then of course you're going to end up swallowing, digesting to some degree, and then regurgitating the general mantras, the dogmas, right? The secular dogmas of our time. And I think that's the way I would see it, is there are certain mantras and dogmas that for various periods of time seem like you'll be a heretic if you don't espouse them and act towards them. And when that sets so deep into institutional life and practice and culture, it's capable of overriding constitutional principle, the letter of the law, right? The spirit behind the letter of the law, the history of that country. So we're seeing that all the time. So, the way that speech and expression is being policed in the UK is a fantastic example of that. We're seeing people arrested for writing lyrics on, lyrics on Twitter that don't pass a criminal threshold. We're seeing people being arrested in the street for saying that biologically there's men and women, and that also Genesis says that, and that's God's design for creation. We see people being arrested like Isabel Vaughan Spruce. Now, technically speaking, are the laws that they're being arrested under, were they designed to arrest those people in that way? Usually the answer is no. But within, for example, the police force or senior figures within the police force that dictate that policy, that cultural kind of disposition towards an ideological enforcement over traditional and clear rights in law, it wins. And so, culture is very significant, and culture is a lot more local than, even in big institutions, than I think a lot of people would assume. It usually boils down to, what is the thing that I can say in this context that will allow me to be accepted or allow me to thrive professionally? And we know what those dogmas are for our time. And so, on the flip side, the more that Catholics and other Christians and other people of common sense and goodwill keep their mouths shut in those contexts, the more extreme our views will seem to be when we do espouse them. And we end up seeing like a smaller minority with a less acceptable view than is actually true. We see this online, we see it in the workplace, we see it even within the church at times too.
When you're describing this situation, it comes to my mind that the policy which was motto for famous Italian communist Spinelli, that we will march through the institutions, is just realized, and it is realized at various levels. So the zeitgeist, which penetrates the minds of civil servants at various levels of authority, it can be destructive to society. I don't want to be malicious, but just one quote from Theresa May during Alfie Evans crisis. I mean, kids are owned by the government. Then she somewhat withdrew from this statement, but it reflects a mindset of many politicians and civil servants. My question is, what to do with that? What we can do as Catholics in such circumstances when on one hand, conservatives and those who defend traditional values might be lazy, might be feared, might be fearful, might be not active enough to stand up. What's your recipe? What's your advice?
Yeah, I think there are kind of 3 stages to reversing that cultural, decline. We need people that are capable of being in a big enough community, so having a critical mass within your context. It might be your workplace, it might be your village, it might be the government, it might be in parliament, whatever the context might be. You need to be in a situation whereby you're in a critical mass of people, where you're at the very least feel like you're in a minority that's big enough that people have your back, that they're there for you, and that you're not just standing alone, or maybe as 1 or 2 or 3. So an absolute priority always is to find others that agree with the truth, and to club up with them. And that might be an informal work society within a civil service department for the government. It might be whatever, a formal group in parliament for parliamentarians. It doesn't matter really what that context is. You just need that critical mass, because, and the people within that critical mass need to be people who have moral courage. Now, how do you get moral courage? Moral courage isn't something that just happens to you overnight. People don't risk everything about their career and their reputation in that big moment, because that big moment arrives. It's very rare that people do that the first time when the big crisis hits. The people that do it when the big crisis hits are people that have got used to doing it in smaller ways on a regular basis. And so moral courage is just like any other virtue. It's something you've got into a habit of doing throughout your life. And so the challenge I would offer to Catholics listening to this, or anybody else that believes in the good and common sense, is, are there small areas of your life right now whereby you could speak out a little with regards to what you really believe and what you know to be true, that might be a bit awkward or difficult, but you're probably going to survive if you do it? Then if that's true, start doing it tomorrow, and do it again the week after, and do it again the week after that, because it'll have 2 effects. It will normalize that view more, particularly if other people share it with you in that context. And secondly, and most importantly, you're starting to build that muscle over time of moral courage. So when the big crisis comes, when that moment, that Thomas More moment, right, that John Fisher moment, when that time to really lay it all on the line comes, you're able to do it because you've developed moral courage. And so it's people who have established moral courage living in community. And I'll say one last thing about that. In order to have moral courage, you need to be convicted of the thing being true itself. And this is, again, a part we can all play for other people. You can't be courageous for something you're not convicted about. And you can't be convicted about something if you don't know it inside out, Mm-hmm. So whether it be the faith, whether it be the reality of life, whether it be that biological male and female, whatever it is, if there are areas where you feel unsure intellectually, then your duty really as a Christian is to go and to learn more, to seek wise counsel, to go and read and listen, so that you can be convicted, and therefore you can be courageous about that issue afterwards.
But as you know, many people have families and they are afraid of being sacked from their jobs. They are afraid of being persecuted in social media, cancelled. And of course, there is a common, I would say, opportunistic behavior in major corporations, because no one wants to be black sheep. And this creates some kind of fear and stops this stand-up position. Even if big corporations have these ethical commissions and some good corporate principles, but in practice, if you stand up and say, well, I don't think that Pride Month propaganda should be addressed to everyone, because not everyone is interested, very few people will stand up and say, well, I'm supporting that. What's your advice for people who are living with families who have this kind of responsibilities? Of course, we can say there are various lines of defense. Any comment on that?
Honestly, it's very, very difficult, because I've done a lot of work with clients of ours, many of whom don't go forward after long conversations and discernments. they're in a situation maybe similar to you describe. They might be in a scenario, you know, where professionally they could lose their job if they take the stand. And for various reasons that are all good reasons, they decide not to do it. And, you know, in almost every case that I've been involved with where that's happened, I've totally understood and often actively encouraged people to take that course of action. I think this is by its very essence a prudential decision, right? Now, obviously, some things are not prudential, like, you know, the corporate bank you work for requires you to go out and murder innocent people in the street. Obviously, that's a moral black and white. There's no prudential assessment to be made there with regards to your own conscience. You have to quit and you have to not do it. And in fact, you then have to resist as well, quite proactively, something like that. But there are situations where it's like, you know what, let me give an example where it isn't a clear black and white for Catholic teaching in and of itself. It isn't necessarily the principle in and of itself, but someone in conscience might be called to take a stand. And that could be an example of a teacher where they don't like the fact that pupil has changed their name, right? So I believe that if I was a teacher, I'll use myself as an example. If I was a teacher next week, and I knew that teaching was the only career I'd really ever had, and I've got a family to feed, and I'm doing good as a Catholic educator otherwise, if the school required me to call a biological female a male proactively, I would resign, or I would refuse to do it and take legal action against that school. And even if that risks my family being impoverished, I believe that the Catholic community has a duty to gather around me and support my family in that circumstance, because we're not islands. Like, Catholic social teaching is that we're part of a common good that is founded on societies that should be mutually supportive of people living in virtue and doing the right thing. And so if I was to do that, I think the Catholic community has a duty to support my family so that we don't starve and it doesn't have that kind of effect on them. And I believe that that is a moral black and white that is very clear. It comes from biblical sources and it comes from principles of church teaching that are very well established. So I would feel like I don't have a choice to decide whether I resign or take legal action there. A more tricky scenario, a grayer scenario, in my view, would be a name change of a pupil. And I know Catholic teachers that for them, that's the red line, and for others, it's not. And so let's say the school says, okay, that's fine. You don't have to use the wrong pronoun for the biological sex of any pupil, but the pupil has changed their name from David to Jennifer as part of signaling that, you know, they've changed gender as they see it. Would I necessarily risk my career on that? And the answer for me would be no. That would be a prudential reasoning of a name in and of itself is significant, but it isn't speaking necessarily to an objective reality in the same way as a pronoun would. Now, the teacher next to me, Sarah, might actually believe for her conscience, prudentially, that is the red line that needs to be drawn, at least for her, before the Lord. And good on her if she takes that case forward. So I think there are scenarios that are not prudential, that are just morally black and white. And I think there are scenarios where I think there are several factors one has to take into account. And if you find yourself in that situation, there are two sources of help you need. Firstly, as a Catholic, you need someone with sound moral reasoning to be able to tell you with authority, no, this is a moral black or white. Like, you can't do this. You do have to resign, or you do have to challenge it. And so have certainty about the moral black and white, because that then allows you to be in a situation where you can then prudentially decide, according to your conscience, is the Lord calling me to make that sacrifice in balance of my duties to my family?
Mm-hmm. You address one of the important elements of the current secular society. You know, in Poland, we've got acceleration of secular trends. According to sociological research, pure research, Polish youth is being secularized the most dynamic way globally. We see that in our families, Catholic families, that kids do not go to church. They absorb all these trends which are present in Western societies. We've got this individualistic, consumer-driven society. and undermining of the concept of objective truth. And in that circumstances, the concept of community supporting those who decided for such bold move to resist the mainstream zeitgeist is a certain problem. How to build community, how to overcome this individualistic consumer zeitgeist, which can paralyze people and not to prevent them from being really witness to truth, if they still believe in objective truth. So how to talk about these things to kids?
Yeah, again, it's going to depend partly on your context. But the one thing I can say is that what's happened in my society, I can't speak for Polish society very well, but what's definitely happened in the UK is that children are growing up in a culture that is, you know, the antithesis of what the Lord made them to flourish in by his created design for them. And what do I mean by that? Like, children are growing up in homes, you know, I think around half, if not more, are growing up in single parent scenarios or broken families here in this country. They are growing up in an environment whereby the local society, as in the people within 3 square miles of where they live, most of whom don't know each other whatsoever, have any ties to each other. Most of those people living in that place have no ties to that place historically and don't plan to necessarily stay there for 5 years or more. That has a big effect on how people treat each other and how deep those relationships can be, that child can be around. And then also on top of that, I think most perniciously, we have, you know, the era of the smartphone. And if you read, you know, the sociological studies about what's happened to children, you know, there's something happened around 2012 that's very, very marked. And that's the moment where girls in particular, because it affects girls more for various reasons, most girls all of a sudden had smartphones. And we see this massive shift in mental health outcomes for children. Now, why do I say that in the context of people keeping the faith? Well, I think there are 2 elements to that. First element is, I think being on a social media network rather than being in a real human community means that you can somehow see yourself as an individual as part of a network. And that's a very different way to growing up with an understanding of yourself in society than if you grow up in a real community. And obviously the way that you relate to others on a social media network is massively different to in real life and how we're designed to work. The other element that is really pernicious is pornography, of course, because, you know, children are bombarded with this on these devices. And if there's anything that's going to kill the spiritual life, kill the life of the soul, that is going to pervert a young man or young woman's sense of their right relationship to each other, their understanding of what true love is and care, then it's pornography, frankly. It is going to kill the spiritual life in that young person. And if that's a habit that establishes, it's as dangerous and as hard to come away from as crack cocaine, if not more. But we don't act as though that's true, right? And so my challenge to fellow Catholic adults is to say, hang on a minute, we've put our children into these scenarios, somehow expecting that they will flourish, that they will have the faith, that they'll have a connection to the spiritual, that, you know, why would we expect that when they're growing up in this toxic environment for themselves? And so I think a big part of the core checklist that we have to make as the adults and the parents of our children is to say, are they in places where they can experience the transcendentals? Are they experiencing love in the truest sense? Are they experiencing real beauty in nature and in the man-made? You know, and do they have access to the truth? And are they doing that in a society that normalizes what Catholic life actually is? In other words, regular prayer, not having access to pornography. In my view, very limited access to digital devices, the great literature being normal, a school environment that is consistently and completely supportive of the parental culture that they want to establish. And so, you know, the headline here for me is we can't do the same thing that our parents' generation did and expect different results for our children. We have to very intentionally rebuild the village in that sense. We build the community that our children are living in, whereby they can flourish, where they can play when they're young rather than just be on social media, where they can enjoy each other's company and it'd be normal to pray. And I, as a parent, know they're not going to be exposed to stuff that could spiritually hurt them. So I'm not making an argument for complete retreat from society, by the way. I'm just making an argument for intentionality about establishing the things again that are part of our God-given nature, that our God-given nature needs in order to flourish and to have faith. It's very hard to have faith in an urban environment where you are an isolated individual on a social network. It's a lot easier to have faith when you're in a community that knows you and loves you, where prayer is normal, where beauty is normal, and where certain standards are kept about behavior. It's a lot easier as a child to grow up as faithful in that situation. And I know, the one thing I do know is in Poland, you have far more opportunity to do that than in the UK, where we're far more disparate in terms of large numbers of deeply committed practicing Catholics. You have much more common critical masses by which you can do that, I think, in your country. So, yeah, intentionality is the headline.
Right. Yeah, I fully agree. And we've got still this cultural Catholicism, which has some potential. People are critical of cultural Catholicism because they say, well, it's not deep enough. It's not, much spiritual, but this is a potential. You can transform it in a positive way. But my question is, this is my last question, and Bishop will take over, what to do with our neo-pagan or secularized neighbors who lost their ways, and they are sometimes aggressive against Christianity, sometimes they are lost. What's your advice to evangelize them, how to preach good news to them in the society which is very, I would say, ignorant or simply reluctant to talk about religious affairs?
I think outside of, obviously, when someone comes to me and says, what's your intellectual reasons for belief in God? I know they're looking for an intellectual conversation, and an intellectual answer might take them somewhere, right? When I'm in a formal debate, the same. But most people that I encounter, who might be antithetical to Catholicism or Christianity, are people that are actually very badly hurt by society, by people, sometimes by the church, people within the church. And so I think there's something broken in their background or in them, either because of things they've done or usually because of things done to them. Like I say, most children are growing up in scenarios that are not what God designed them to be in. And some people have never experienced any real tangible sense of what self-sacrificial love is for them. And so I think the headline for the church and those of us within it is that I think we're all broken and we all need healing. And I think that's especially true of people that have no formal connection or intentional connection to Jesus Christ. And so maybe that's the lens we should take to this. And I think we're living at a time whereby society is ill. Society is sick. We're living in a culture of death. We're living in a culture of nihilism and ugliness and narcissism. And we're living in a culture whereby people are not seeing hope or answers or beauty anywhere. We can be that. We can be that. And to refer back to my previous answer, it's a lot easier for us to be that if we're doing it in community, right? It's a lot easier for me to invite my neighbor over to, I don't know, the Friday evening dinner that, 5 families share in the biggest house of the families, whereby we just have fun, like normal human regular fun, and people clearly love each other and their children are clearly happy, and this person is in that environment, an environment like that, for the first time ever. And the thing that happens that unites everyone at the end is that they pray to the God who is their father and healer, who loves them unconditionally, and language like that is used in front of them. Like, what could we do with them that is better than that? But that relies on some level of community. That relies on a pattern of life and regular rituals in our life outside of liturgy that we can invite people into, that are healing and wholesome and are just life as God designed us to have in society. And obviously, there are very specific things we can do as a church to heal people too, like sex addiction, pornography addiction. Alcoholics Anonymous has been extremely successful in bringing people back to some limited belief in Christianity, because Christianity is quite explicitly there in the principles. Well, most of the deaneries of the parishes I know could easily put on a group for men who are struggling with, virtue as a man or sex addiction, and people would come to know the Lord through that, through the other men that they meet. That's just one concrete example that would cost us very little money, would involve a few hours work a week by some of the men in the community, and would help heal people. And that through that healing, they'll come to know the Lord and be open to the Lord. But I think they've been sold this narrative that Jesus and belief in him is the source of all that pain and sorrow, and it's the opposite. And just saying it isn't enough. We've got to live it in a way that's really convincing.
Okay, that's quite powerful. Ryan, let me ask you maybe two questions at once to make it more difficult. So question number one is, so the background of the question is, I think that the revolution is progressing more smoothly and faster in the West, or it started earlier in the West than it started here in Poland. And in the past, it was maybe 30 years difference. Now maybe smaller, hard to say how much. But let's say a decade or a decade and a half. So if you look in hindsight, what is it that you missed 20 years ago, 15 years ago, that you should have taken care of in order not to find yourself in the situation that you are in Britain right now? So in essence, what is your advice for us now? What should we stop now? So that's question number one. And question number two is, if that is in fact true, that the revolution is attacking you first, what are the directions that freedom is being limited and destroyed in Britain right now that we might not be seeing here? What should we expect in the future?
I mean, they're big questions. So, I mean, I think with regards to things that can be done now that would have paid a massive, massive dividend for us in the UK in my generation, I think, again, to start with the church and to start with those of us, all lay people and clergy, who have responsibility for Christ's body in the broadest sense. I think there was a complacency because we were still quite big. I think there was a complacency because we ran lots of, Catholic schooling here in the UK is massive still. And, you go back 20 years, we'd started to see that really radical dip of attendance in church, but it hadn't come through to the extent that, we've seen in the last 20. So go back to the 70s, late 70s. I think there would still be this sense of everything's kind of okay. Some people are lapsing. But I think it was within the context of the Catholic Church seeing itself as, having barely reestablished itself after the Reformation, frankly, because the reestablishment here was in the 1860s, give or take. I think if in a Polish context, I think that intentionality that I spoke about a few questions ago, again, is the key. Because, you're not going to get a strong culture. We talked about how culture within institutions can override the letter of the law or override the will of the executive, even in a workplace scenario. Well, the question, I think, for the church and for Catholics is, do we actually have a Catholic culture local to me? Or do we have Catholic practices, right? Is it that most of us are just going to Mass on a Sunday and we send our kids to the Catholic school and we do a couple of other things, that are broadly Catholic in a title, but we're not building a really integrated Catholic culture for our community and our society and our children? I think that difference in intentionality is the key, because that Catholic practices, whilst I'm not judging anyone who does that, by the way, at all. I don't mean it in that sense. But if most people are just doing those practices rather than building intentional Catholic culture, then it's not going to have the strength to survive, and it will fall off a cliff very quickly when secularism comes to challenge it. And so, again, I think it's a question of intentionality, of positive building. And, you know, I'd put it in these terms. If a third of Catholic families had had the mutual support in order to keep their children practicing 20 years ago, the Catholic Church in this country would be massively bigger than it is now. And so a big part of it is tending to that which doesn't seem maybe quite broken yet, as it does in the UK, right? Let's really make sure families are supporting each other for their children to practice the faith. Let's really make sure we're supporting the priest in there being a Catholic culture in the parish, not just, and a broader life around that, those practices, not just touch points with Catholic institutions or touch points with Catholic liturgy only. And I know that sounds a bit vaguer than it could, but I do actually think that's the heart of the matter. Frankly, I do. And then, of course, you know, the next generation or the current generation can't have moral courage and can't be convicted if they don't know. And one of the things that happened in the UK after the Second Vatican Council, it's a very broad thing I'm saying here, I'm aware, is, and I'm not saying the Second Vatican Council was bad, by the way, I want to be really clear about that. But one of the things I think that did happen in practice after the Second Vatican Council here is that we stopped teaching with a sense of confidence and authority. So prior to the Second Vatican Council, you know, catechetics were quite well grooved and established. I'm not saying it was perfect. There were lots of problems. But what definitely happened after the council is that there was this sense of, can we still teach the same things in the same way we always have? And I don't think we ever truly got our act together more broadly as a Catholic community to what systematic catechesis looks like in practice in our community until very recently. And of course, very recently, as in my generation, is too late to handle the sexual revolution, the new reproductive technologies, the fact that teenagers, for the first time in the 70s, had their own financial power at a younger age, and the digital revolution that we've seen more recently. Like, we needed that reestablishment of knowledge in order to build conviction a generation or two before we've started to, you know, patch it back together here in this country. I don't know how that applies to Poland, but you may see some similarities. I don't know.
Yeah, I think that this is a very good piece of advice. So, sort of strengthen ourselves, not allow the opponent to break us down into individuals, and help each other in strengthening the faith. And I think what I understood, I'm not sure if I understood correctly from you, is that sort of the Catholic Church and the Catholic tradition and religion is the backbone of a healthy society and a healthy state. And if that goes, all goes. And by the way, since your father was Polish, do you speak Polish?
No, sadly not.
Okay, well, that's a pity. That's a pity. I hope. I
nearly looked some up just to say it and look good, but there we go. I didn't have time to stroke my own ego, my pride.
That's fine. You look good enough, you know, with your English language. So, you know, I think our time has expired. So let me express our gratitude for this time. This is a lot of very interesting, very useful information, and presented in a magnificent, splendid way. So thank you very much for your time. Thank you for your words of advice for us. And, you know, let's hope that we can sort of support each other across the borders and help together rebuild the Catholic Church as it used to be, the universal church, the global church.
Right.
It's a real pleasure. On my part, thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you very much for ADF, Alliance Defending Freedom. Fantastic mission, which really has growing value in contemporary society. So thank you for that contribution. This is very important for us. It's a good example. And I think in Poland, hearing what you said, people get really strengthened because someone is standing behind them. So thanks a lot for your contribution in that respect. And by the way,
sorry, go ahead.
I can't take credit for it, but honestly, it's a great comfort to me that ADF exists personally as well. So it's a privilege to do this work, and ask people to pray that the Lord blesses it if it be His will.
Let me just plug Ordo Iuris here for a second, because we have just won the final case of a person who was fired from IKEA for quoting the Bible, and now he's restored to work. So hopefully such situations are not going to be happening. Yeah. Thank you very much.
Thank you, guys.
Goodbye.